Every spring, in one European country, men weave whips out of willow branches and gently switch the legs of the women they know, and the women thank them for it. It sounds insane until you understand where it comes from. This is a place of dark forests and fairy tale castles, of water spirits and secret mushroom spots, where the strangest traditions in Europe are still practiced with a straight face. Welcome to the Czech Republic. The land before the history. Before the Czech Republic was a country of revolutions and empires, it was a landscape, and the landscape is quietly one of the most beautiful in Europe. Though it rarely makes the postcards, because the postcards all stop at Prague. Leave the city in almost any direction and the country opens into forest. Nearly a third of it is wooded, and the woods are not decoration, they are where the Czech soul goes on weekends. In the southwest, along the old border with Bavaria, the Šumava spreads out, a vast, dark expanse of spruce and peat bog and glacial lakes, one of the largest unbroken forests in Central Europe. So still in places that it was left half wild for decades because the Iron Curtain ran straight through it and nobody was allowed in. What the border froze, nature kept. Today it is a national park where lynx move through the trees and the silence has a texture to it. North, toward Poland, the land rises into the Krkonoše, the giant mountains, the roof of the country. They are old, rounded peaks rather than jagged alpine ones, worn soft by time, and on the highest of them, Śnieżka. The wind comes across bare stone and dwarf pine that survives nowhere else in the country. From the source high in these mountains, the Elbe begins as a thread you could step across, before it grows into one of the great rivers of Europe. People come to ski in winter and to walk the ridgelines in summer when the whole range turns green and the valleys below fill with the particular light of a Central European afternoon. Then there is the country underground. In Moravia, in the east, water has spent millions of years hollowing the limestone into the Moravian karst, a labyrinth of caves, underground rivers, and one staggering piece of geology called the Makocha Abyss, a sinkhole plunging some 138 meters straight down, with a river running through the dark at the bottom that visitors cross by boat, gliding through caverns hung with stone the color of candle wax. Above ground, the same region softens into Moravia's wine hills, rows of vines rolling toward the Austrian border under a bigger, warmer sky than the north ever gets. And laced through all of it, everywhere, are the castles. The Czech lands hold more castles and chateaux per square kilometer than almost anywhere on Earth, over 2,000 of them, perched on crags, mirrored in ponds, half swallowed by forest. Karlstein rising out of the woods on its hill. Český Krumlov wrapped in a loop of the Vltava like a town inside a river's embrace, its castle tower painted in Renaissance patterns, the whole place looking less built than dreamed. Hluboká, white and turreted, lifted straight out of a fairy tale. These are not ruins kept for tourists. They are the ordinary furniture of the Czech countryside, the thing you round a bend and simply find. The Vltava ties the whole picture together. The country's longest river rises down in the Šumava forests and runs north, against the European habit, gathering the land as it goes, past the wine hills and the castle towns, and finally through Prague, before it feeds the Elbe and eventually reaches the sea it was never given directly. Follow that river and you have crossed the whole country, forest to mountain to vineyard to stone. A landlocked place with no coast built its beauty inward instead, in the trees, the caves, the peaks, and the water threading between them. The women and the question of choice. Czech women photograph the way Central Europe tends to photograph. Fair skin, light eyes, the bone structure that comes from Slavic, Germanic, and Celtic lines, braided together over a very long time. They dress with a certain deliberateness even for unremarkable errands. They move through the city without the faint apology, in the posture that some cultures still teach their daughters. But the surface is the least interesting thing about them, and if you stop at it, you have missed the story entirely. What sits underneath is a particular relationship to choice, and it has a history. Start with the literacy rate, 99%, spread evenly across genders, in a country that has treated education as non-negotiable under every regime it has hosted, partly because every regime, whatever else it wanted, needed a workforce that could read a manual and run a machine. Czech women finish university at rates that match or outrun the men. They fill professions that other European societies still quietly code as male. The confidence you read on the street is not a recent fashion. It has been accumulating for 3 generations. And a strange share of it is downstream of the same event that produced the country's atheism. When the communist state pushed the church out of public life, it did not only remove God, it removed the single largest institution that, across most of Europe, had spent centuries defining what a woman was for. The Catholic architecture around marriage, virtue, family, and acceptable ambition simply lost its enforcement power here the way faith itself did. Women who came of age in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s built their sense of themselves inside a different frame, and they handed a different set of assumptions to their daughters. The result is a kind of freedom that resists a clean label. It is not the freedom of a movement that named its enemies and fought them for specific rights. It is more atmospheric than that, a baseline assumption, held widely and without much fuss, that what a woman does with her own life is her own affair. In a society that has largely stopped treating private choices as public moral questions. This is the context the famous statistic lives inside. The Czech Republic, home to about 10.5 million people, well under 1% of the planet, accounts for something on the order of 13% of the global adult film industry's output, by research from a few years back. Together with Hungary, it leads European production by a wide margin. And Czech performers appear not only across the continent but throughout the American market. The industry operates legally, openly, without the shroud of shame it would carry in a country where religious or conservative frameworks still police the public definition of morality. Ask Czechs about it, and the answers come back consistent and unsentimental. Choice, money, the absence of shame. Women enter the industry by their own decision, understand the economics going in, and go on with their lives. Frequently in other careers, in parallel careers, without the arc of ruin that outside narratives keep trying to write for them. These conversations happen quietly, not because anyone is ashamed, but because Czechs generally keep personal matters personal. Most visitors pass through the city with no idea any of it is there. It exists in the same square mile as the Kafka Museum and the Charles Bridge and a 1,000-year-old cathedral, and Prague sees no contradiction in that at all. The question worth sitting inside is not the moral one about the industry. It is the structural one underneath it. What does a real choice actually require to exist? A society running at 99% literacy, with functioning public services, no dominant religious authority, and a deep individualist streak, produces a specific kind of person, educated, self-governing, genuinely indifferent to other people's opinions about her decisions. That person exists in Prague in large numbers. The adult film figure is one data point about her. The book at the tram stop is another. Both are true at the same time, and neither cancels the other. Set her beside the Chamorro women holding Guam together through a matrilineal culture built over thousands of unbroken years, and you have two entirely different blueprints for female strength. One raised on tradition that never broke, one raised on tradition that broke and was never replaced with anything that told women what they were not allowed to be. Different origins, a similar steadiness in the result. Each deserves to be understood on its own terms rather than through a frame borrowed from somewhere else. The things Czechs do when nobody is watching. You learn a country fastest through its small rituals, the things people do out of habit, without explaining, because everyone around them does the same. In the Czech Republic, those rituals are strange, specific, and quietly wonderful. Start at the pub, because half of Czech culture lives there. This is one of the heaviest beer-drinking nations on earth, and the drinking is not really about getting drunk. It is the social operating system, the place where friendships, business, and complaints all get processed over a half-liter that costs €1. There is etiquette to it. You do not clink and drink in one motion. You say na zdraví. Look each person dead in the eye as the glasses meet. Breaking eye contact is quietly rude. Knock the base of the glass once against the table, and only then drink. When your beer runs low, you do not order. You simply set the empty glass at the table's edge and a fresh one appears, marked with a pencil stroke on the little paper tab. The tab running until you say the magic word, "Zaplatím," I'll pay, and settle the whole quiet arithmetic at once. Then there is the Czech relationship to the forest, which outsiders rarely expect. Come autumn, a serious share of the country walks into the woods to hunt mushrooms. Hubážení, it is called, and it is close to a national sport. Families have secret spots handed down like inheritances, guarded more carefully than recipes. People genuinely know their fungi, which ones to fill a basket with and which will end a weekend, and a good haul of hřiby ends up fried, pickled, dried for winter, or folded into a mushroom scramble that is practically the national breakfast the morning after a good rain. It is a whole population that never quite left the forest behind. And they never quite left off telling stories in it either. Czech folk culture is full of the vodník, a green water sprite who lurks in ponds and rivers, keeps the souls of the drowned in little lidded teacups, and is best not annoyed. It sounds like a children's tale until you notice how seriously the water is still treated, how many villages still keep their small superstitions about it. This is the culture that also gave the world Rusalka, Dvořák's opera about a water spirit who trades her voice for a chance at a human she loves. The most beautiful aria in it, the Song to the Moon, sung by a creature who cannot survive the very love she is reaching for. The calendar has its own theater. At Easter, in a custom that startles every foreigner who meets it, boys weave whips out of fresh willow, the pomlaska, and lightly, ceremonially, switch the legs of women and girls, who in return tie ribbons to the whip and hand over painted eggs or a shot of something strong. It is meant, in the old logic, to pass on the spring's health and vitality of the willow, and yes, most young Czechs today will roll their eyes at it and do it anyway, because that is what tradition is. Come December, on the eve of St. Nicholas, 3 figures roam the streets together: Mikuláš the saint, an angel, and a chert, a devil in chains, soot-faced, rattling, there to ask small children whether they have been good, and to threaten, entirely in fun, to carry the bad ones off in his sack. Underneath all of it runs a particular Czech register that is hard to translate, dry, self-deprecating, allergic to grand statements. This is the country that produced Švejk, the fictional soldier who survives an entire war by playing the fool so convincingly no one can tell whether he is an idiot or a genius, quietly sabotaging everything around him. That is the national sense of humor in one character, never loud, never earnest, always slipping a blade of irony under the table. A people who spent centuries under other people's empires learned that you do not win by shouting. You win by outlasting, with a straight face and a full glass, and a story about a water sprite you only half pretend not to believe. a nation that goes to the forest. There is a habit here that outsiders never see coming, and it tells you more about the Czech character than any monument does. Come late summer and autumn, after the first real rains, a serious share of the entire country gets up early, takes a wicker basket and a small knife, and disappears into the woods to hunt mushrooms. It is called hubášení, and calling it a hobby undersells it. It is closer to a national instinct. Surveys have found that the large majority of Czech households go mushrooming at least once a year, a rate of participation no other country in Europe comes close to. On a good weekend after rain, the forests fill quietly with people of every age, heads down, moving slowly through the undergrowth, reading the ground with an attention most cultures reserve for screens. Grandparents who can barely manage the stairs will still find their way to a favorite slope. Children learn the difference between edible and deadly before they learn to ride a bike. And the knowledge is real. The average Czech can name and identify dozens of species on sight. The prized hřib, the country's beloved porcini, with its fat, pale stem and sponge underside, chanterelles glowing egg yellow in the moss, the ones you fill a basket with, and the handful that will quietly kill you, told apart by a glance at the gills, the cut, the way the flesh changes color in the air. This is not foraging as a lifestyle trend. It is folk science, passed down at the exact age a child is old enough to hold a knife, refined across a lifetime of Sundays. The secrecy is half the pleasure. A good mushroom spot is a family secret, guarded more jealously than a recipe, its location never spoken aloud and handed down like an inheritance. People will take deliberate wrong turns to shake a follower. They will lie cheerfully about where the basket came from. Ask a Czech where they found such a beautiful haul, and you will get a warm smile and absolutely no useful information, because some things are sacred, and the location of the porcini is one of them. Then comes the part that justifies the whole ritual: eating it. The haul gets fried with butter and caraway, or scrambled into eggs with a splash of cream to make smaženicza, practically the national dish of the morning after a good rain. What cannot be eaten fresh is threaded onto strings and dried above the stove for winter, or pickled in jars, so that the taste of an October forest can be spooned out over a Christmas soup months later. A single basket becomes a season's worth of meals, and a family's supply of the one flavor that means home. But the deepest thing about hubášení is not the mushrooms at all. It is what the forest still means to this landlocked people. Through every empire and occupation, when the cities belonged to somebody else's flag, the woods belonged to no one and to everyone. You could walk into them freely, a right written into Czech law, the freedom to roam any forest and take what grows wild, and for a few hours be answerable to nothing but the weather and your own eye for the ground. A country that spent centuries being told what it was permitted to do kept one thing that was always, quietly, its own. Every autumn it still walks back into the trees to claim it. What happens to a country that stops believing? Here is the figure that stops most people cold: 91%. That is the share of Czechs between 16 and 29 who call themselves atheist. Not agnostic, not spiritual in a vague way, not lapsed but still something on the forms. Atheist, flatly stated. It is the highest rate anywhere in Europe, above Estonia, above Sweden, above the Nordic countries that usually own the top of these lists. Across the whole population, roughly 40% believe in no God at all, and another 30% decline to engage the question when asked. In the geographic heart of Catholic Central Europe, God has quietly emptied out of the building. To see how a country landed here, you have to go back to 1948 and the arrival of a regime that was explicitly, programmatically anti-religious. Churches were surveilled, priests were jailed, religious instruction was pushed out of schools, and the ordinary practice of faith was made quietly expensive. in careers denied, in promotions withheld, in the slow social cost of being the family that still went. For 4 decades, an entire society learned to run without God as a public presence. Children grew up with no catechism. Communities organized their weeks and their milestones around other things. The muscle memory of faith, the rhythms, the ceremonies, the framework that hands life a shape, went slack from disuse. Then 1989 came, and here is the part that separates the Czechs from their neighbors. It never came back. Poland surged into a religious revival after communism. So, in their own ways, did Romania, Slovakia, stretches of the former Soviet Union. The Czech Republic simply did not. The detachment had sunk in too far, or the country had looked around at what organized religion did elsewhere and quietly decided it preferred the vacancy. Either way, 3 generations have now grown up with no religious operating system running in the background, and the society has had to write its own from scratch. What moved into the empty space is a fierce, almost combative individualism, though not the American kind, with its noise about competition and self-promotion. The Czech version runs quieter and further inward, a settled conviction that what a person does with their own body, their own hours, and their own mind is nobody else's jurisdiction. Tattoos mark something like 1 in 3 people under 40, worn not as rebellion against anything in particular, but as ordinary decoration, the body treated as a surface that belongs to the person standing in it. Marijuana is decriminalized. Gambling is legal and regulated. The adult film industry, as we have already seen, is discussed with the same shrug people elsewhere reserve for changing jobs. Private choices are respected here, with a thoroughness that can leave visitors from more supervised societies faintly dizzy. This is what happens to a country that has watched authority, divine, imperial, fascist, communist, fail it completely and repeatedly. It stops outsourcing its conscience. It stops waiting for permission it no longer believes any institution has the standing to grant, and it rebuilds its morality on the one foundation that never collapsed underneath it: the individual person, choosing and living with what the choice costs. The astronomical clock in the old town square runs its little theater every hour. Figures sliding out, a bell, a rooster, a ring of tourists lifting their phones. The legend attached to it is the part worth keeping. The craftsman who built the clock was blinded afterward, on the order of a Czech king who wanted to be certain no rival city would ever get one to match it. Ruined and enraged, the craftsman is said to have thrown himself into the mechanism, sabotaging it so thoroughly that no one could repair it for 50 years. Prague tells that story on the hour, every hour, and it does not tell it as tragedy, it tells it as instruction. Authority will take whatever it wants from you, leave it something to regret. The things Czech hands made. Strip away the history and the sociology and you reach the layer underneath all of it. A manufacturing civilization, and an old one. These lands have been making things for a very long time. Bohemian glass, automotive parts, precision machinery. The Škoda badge, founded in 1895, folded into the Volkswagen Group now but stubbornly Czech in identity and in the minds of the people who drive it, is the most common car on Prague's streets. The Kodiak turning up at nearly every intersection, most of them newer than 2020, most of them rolling over roads that are actually maintained. A country spent 40 years being told what to think and kept intact, the whole time its capacity to build things that work. Its scientific output runs wildly out of proportion to its size. Otto Wichterle, a Czech chemist, invented the soft contact lens in the early 1960s, assembling his first working spinning rig out of a child's building set and a bicycle dynamo, because the state would not give him the equipment, and turning improvisation into something now sitting in tens of millions of eyes. Gregor Mendel, the friar who worked out the fundamental laws of inheritance by growing peas in a monastery garden in Brno, lived and labored in what is now this country. His results were ignored for decades and then quietly became the foundation of modern genetics. The country even gave the world words. Franz Kafka was born in Prague and wrote, in German, about ordinary people trapped inside systems that were opaque, arbitrary, and impossible to appeal. And his name became an adjective, Kafkaesque, the global shorthand for exactly that kind of institutional nightmare. Coined for a man who grew up watching the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy administer its subjects with precisely that flavor. And robot itself is Czech. The playwright Karel Čapek introduced it in a 1920 play, built from the old word for forced labor, to name artificial beings made to do the work humans would rather not. The word raced around the planet decades before the technology it described existed. A country that had spent centuries performing other people's forced labor handed the world the concept of the machine that could take it over. The dancing house on the riverbank, Frank Gehry and Vlado Milunic built between 1994 and 1996, nicknamed Fred and Ginger for the way its two towers seemed to lean into a step together, was not universally loved when it went up. It clashes on purpose with the 19th century facades beside it, and the architectural establishment was not thrilled. It got built anyway, and it turned into an icon almost immediately, because it said something true about the country after 1989. A society climbing out of a gray ideological box and trying, sometimes awkwardly and sometimes brilliantly, to work out what it actually looks like now that it is allowed to choose. And the national sport, tellingly, is not football but ice hockey, a game of cold and speed and controlled violence, followed through the long winter with the devotion other countries pour into their leagues, its greatest figure, Jaromír Jágr, still lacing up professionally into his late 40s, one of the highest scorers the NHL has ever recorded. Come back to the astronomical clock. Every hour the skeleton rings its bell. The apostles turn past the little windows. The rooster crows. The phones go up. It has kept time, on and off, since 1410. The man who built it was blinded so he could never build another, sabotaged it in his fury, and was proven right by 6 centuries of it running anyway. Prague repeats that story to anyone standing in the square, hour after hour, and what it says is this: authority will take what it wants, so build something good enough to outlast it. The Jewish quarter still stands. The medieval streets still stand. The language survived every empire that tried to reach inside it. A country that lost its God, its empire, its union, and was occupied twice in living memory, and still builds, still reads at the tram stop, still makes beer cheaper than water, that country has earned a rare kind of credibility. Not the credibility of a place things went well for, the credibility of a place that kept going anyway.